Since the beginning of 2026, actions by former President Donald J. Trump, spanning military interventions, domestic legal investigations, foreign trade confrontations, and realignments among traditional U.S. allies have set off a cascade of geopolitical tremors that are being felt across continents. A surprise U.S. military operation in Venezuela that led to the arrest and transfer of President Nicolas Maduro to New York, a contentious law enforcement incident in Minneapolis with nationwide protests, a criminal probe involving Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell, and threatened tariffs against European states over Greenland have together cast Washington's policies into sharp, unsettling relief. At the same time, a dramatic shift in relations between Canada and China, highlight Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney's state visit to Beijing, suggests a possible reconfiguration of alliances traditionally anchored by the United States. This expansive look at recent developments explores the wide-ranging, interlocking political, legal, and diplomatic consequences of these events, analyzing not only what has occurred, but why it matters for the future shape of international relations and domestic governance. U.S. military action if a measure of a head of state, the operation and its aftermath. On January 3, 2026, U.S. forces launched a deeply controversial military action targeting Venezuela's authoritarian leader, Nicolas Maduro, resulting in his capture along with his wife, Celia Flores, and their transfer to New York on federal narcotics and weapons charges. President Trump described this as a decisive action against drug trafficking and global insecurity, declaring that the U.S. would oversee Venezuela until such time as we can do a safe, proper, and judicious transition. The operation, described by U.S. authorities as a large-scale strike, involved coordinated aerial assault and special forces extraction in Caracas. While details remain clouded by official secrecy, reports suggest extensive prior military buildup in the Caribbean, repeated strikes on vessels alleged to be linked with drug trafficking, and the designation of Venezuelan entities as terrorist organizations in the months leading up to the raid. Legal controversy and international law. The seizure of a sitting sovereign leader raises profound legal controversies. Constitutional scholars argue that without express congressional authorization or an extradition treaty, such an operation may violate both U.S. law and international legal norms. Critics contend that unilateral abductions undermine established prince sovereignty and risk setting dangerous global precedents. Strategic and economic stakes. Oil and energy control. Following Maduro's capture, the U.S. asserted control over Venezuelan oil flows, reportedly intercepting and moving millions of barrels to American refineries. In statements to industry executives, U.S. energy officials projected potential growth in Venezuelan oil production by as much as 30% if investment and infrastructure modernization efforts proceed under U.S. influence. Oil, which historically placed Venezuela among the world's top crude producers, now stands at the heart of Washington's strategy, blurring lines between counter-drug operations and resource geopolitics. Regional uproar and global reactions. The dramatic U.S. move drew polarized reactions across Latin America. Right-wing leaders in Ecuador and Chile celebrated Maduro's removal as a blow to leftist forces. While leftist and centrist figures in Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, and other nations condemned it as American imperialism and a threat to regional stability. Internationally, Russia and China strongly criticized the intervention and demanded the release of Maduro and Flores, underscoring the risk of escalating tensions between global domestic tensions. Minneapolis incident and Federal Reserve turmoil. The Minneapolis killing and public unrest. Amid heightened global conflict, domestic tensions in the United States have surged. In Minneapolis, an immigration and customs enforcement officer shot and killed Renee Good, a civilian whose death sparked mass protests and intensified already fraught relations between federal authorities and local governance. Reports show clashes between demonstrators and law enforcement, deepening divisions about immigration enforcement and police accountability. The incident has drawn scrutiny from civil rights groups and renewed among state officials who argue that federal immigration agents overstepped their authority. Federal Reserve Chair under investigation. In an unprecedented legal development, the Department of Justice announced a criminal investigation into Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell, centering on actions he took while in office. Although precise allegations are being withheld, the probe has fueled widespread debate over central bank independence, governance ethics, and political interference in financial institutions. Transatlantic tensions, Greenland tariffs, and trade strife in Europe. Diplomatic relations with the United States have been strained by a separate dispute. President Trump's pledge to impose new tariffs on 8 European countries in response to their resistance to U.S. efforts to acquire Greenland, a strategic Arctic territory. Trump's fixation with Greenland, including repeated offers to purchase the territory, has alarmed NATO allies and raised questions about the long-term health of transatlantic security cooperation. German and French officials have publicly discussed retaliatory measures, and the European Union has convened an emergency summit to coordinate a unified response, raising the specter of a trade conflict between Washington and Brussels. The threat of tariffs has heightened fears of a broader trade war that could disrupt markets and erode trust among traditional partners. Canada's state visit of Carrick visit and strategic partnership, in a stark contrast to the strains in U.S. ally relations. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney's state visit to Beijing has captured diplomatic attention. This was the first such visit by a Canadian leader to China in nearly a decade, culminating in the announcement of a new strategic partnership between Ottawa and Beijing, a development that could have long-lasting ramifications. Carney's public comment that China is a more predictable partner than the United States signifies a broader shift in sentiment among U.S. allies who may be reassessing geopolitical alignments amid U.S. unpredictability. Implications for Western alliances. While Canada remains a member of NATO and a key U.S. partner, Carney's outreach to China reflects growing frustration among liberal democracies with perceived instability in U.S. foreign policy. Some analysts suggest that this pivot may encourage deeper economic and diplomatic engagement between Western states and Beijing, altering the balance of influence among global powers at a critical juncture. International reaction and power dynamics. Global human rights and ethical concerns. International bodies, including the United Nations and human rights organizations, have expressed alarm at the U.S. intervention in Venezuela, warning it could undermine established international legal frameworks and embolden other nations to act unilaterally in violation of sovereign borders. At the same time, voices within sectors like ethics and religion, including statements from senior military chaplains, have suggested that U.S. military personnel may face moral conflicts in carrying out orders that contravene international norms. Escalation in anti-trafficking operations. U.S. military operations have expanded beyond Venezuela, with recent strikes on suspected drug smuggling vessels in the Eastern Pacific resulting in casualties and ongoing search and rescue efforts. These actions form part of an aggressive counter-narcotics campaign that has killed scores of individuals and attracted criticism over proportionality and legality. What this means for global order, shifting influence, and power balances taken together, these developments signal a moment of strategic realignment. Traditional alliances are under strain, new partnerships are forming, and the very foundations of international law and norms are being tested. The U.S. willingness to unilaterally intervene militarily and to lever retaliations like tariffs against allies suggests a more transactional and unpredictable foreign policy approach, one that can reshape global governance patterns. The future of NATO and transatlantic relations, with European states pushing back against U.S. policy, and allies like Canada forging deeper ties with adversarial powers, the future cohesion of alliances, such as NATO, may hinge on whether the United States returns to more predictable diplomatic engagement or continues to pursue unilateral initiatives.